investor confidence changed on a dime. Perhaps it was the realization of new market fundamentals, whatever it is. Investor confidence in these countries plummeted. When investor confidence plummets, investors are quick to pull their money out of a certain economy. Now when that happens, asset price values tend to fall dramatically. Right? Think about it. If everybody sold all of their holdings in Thailand and withdrew their money from Thailand, what would that do to the Thailand stock market? It would get crushed. What would that do to the value of the baht, the Thai baht? It would depreciate, right? Because people would sell their holdings and then convert it to whatever home currency they had, right? Capital flight increases the sensitivity of countries to the whims of the global investing public. Okay? The phenomenon by which countries become more vulnerable to capital flight, okay, is related to capital account liberalization. It's a key concept of the so-called Washington Consensus. Okay? Capital account liberalization. It's a fine book by a political economist named Ravi Abdullah called Capital Rules, that discusses how the norm of open capital markets really transfixed the World Bank, OECD, etc. And describes quite eloquently how South Korea's membership of the OECD was actually conditional upon them liberalizing their capital account, i.e. becoming more vulnerable to speculative inflows and speculative outflows. Okay? So that's how globalization and development can go hand in hand. Having access to large pools of foreign capital is very good if you want to develop quickly, if you want to finance new investment, because it allows you to borrow from abroad and have deeper and faster capital accumulation. So arguably, capital account liberalization is very good for these countries, and yet it increases their vulnerability and sensitivity, which is a potential drawback. Okay? It's another reason why globalization and development and today go hand in hand. And finally, we have the greater creation and diffusion of information, ideas, and technology across borders. Playing catch-up today is far easier than playing catch-up in the early 20th century. Communication, the transaction costs have fallen quite a bit with the laying of fiber optic cable across the world. Okay? Best practices, management expertise, know-how, all of those things travel much faster today. And as such, it allows countries who are less developed to harness the benefits of innovation faster, etc. Ideas are quick to transform in cross borders, etc. Now, Jagdish Bhagwati, a famous trade economist, talks about the notion of economic globalization is the integration of national economies into the international economy through various channels of interaction. Trade, FDI, capital flows, greater migration, flows of technology, etc. All of these things, in one way or the other, implicate economic development of countries. Okay? Now, one thing that often gets ignored, and yet I would posit is a critical component of economic development, is the role of state power. State power and economic development. Now, SAIS professor Michael Mandelbaum wrote a book in 2006 known as The Case for Goliath. Have any of you heard of it? When you've heard of it, I see a couple people nodding. So, in this book, Dr. Mandelbaum argues that the United States serves the function of de facto global government. It's the provider of various public goods. What are some of those public goods? What does the United States provide that kind of greases the wheels of international commerce?
Safe shipping lanes.
Safe shipping lanes. That's a huge one, right? The United States guarantees free shipping lanes from the Straits of Malacca to the Cape of Good Hope. There are multiple choke points in the international system that the United States guarantees free commercial access to. What else? Anybody? Yep.
Liquidity for financial markets.
That's a great one. The United States is the lender of last resort via the Federal Reserve in the IMF, and as a result, they provide a great deal of financial backstops to the global financial system, and we saw that in full force in 2008. Right? What else? Well, a lot of trade is conducted in what currency? Dollars, right? So the United States provides the global reserve currency. Right? This is a big contentious point now, especially as the dollar continues to depreciate with the different rounds of quantitative easing, asset purchases programs on behalf of the Federal Reserve. Okay? The United States also provides, related to the global reserve currency, the global reserve asset. The Treasury bond is a global reserve asset, which allows foreign central banks to conduct open market operations internationally. And moreover, and this is something that often gets ignored, the United States simply provides a great deal of security benefit for an overwhelming majority of the advanced industrial world. Through specific alliances with Korea, with Japan, and also NATO, the United States provides a security umbrella that allows states to specialize and engage in mutually prosperous trade without worrying about potential security elements of that trade. In other words, state power is a critical component to this globalized system, which in turn allows states to develop economically. Okay? Now, what's the implication of this argument today? If you buy into the argument that globalization requires a hegemon that provides global public goods and whose ability to dominate the international system allows for globalization in terms of economic benefits, then how might you view the rise of different countries today, like China? This is a very SICE type question. Come on, what do you guys think?
Potential threat to the stability of the system.
Absolutely, because why might that be the case? What might China do?
Well, if the U.S. is the guarantor, if it's the hegemon, and its power and its supremacy is challenged, then everything that hegemonic power provides, the open shipping lanes, the currency of last resort, treasury bonds, etc.,
yep,
potentially threatened.
But yeah, potentially. So that's a hugely destabilizing force if the renminbi, for instance, were to replace the dollar, right? What's critical to this is that being the global hegemon provides certain benefits, okay, to the state that provides that power. And other states might seek those benefits. And so economists talk, and particularly political scientists too, talk about different ages of globalization. And they talk about the first age of globalization taking place, namely prior to the outbreak of the First World War. Okay? Where Britain was the hegemon that provided free global shipping lanes, the global reserve asset, the global reserve currency, and whose supremacy was threatened by Germany, ultimately culminating in the chaos of World War I and later the period of great tariffs and economic disintegration during the interwar period. Okay? So understand that the world as it stands today is very contingent and dependent on these power dynamics. That's probably the last we'll say about it during this course, yet it's something that you should be aware of in all of your readings thus far, and continuing. Okay? And finally, this theory, in case you want to read more about it, is known as Kindleberger's hegemonic stability theory. In case you want to read more about it. Also, Robert Gilpin, Arthur Princeton spends a lot of time talking about this as well. Okay? Cool. So that's development as it relates to globalization. Now, item number 5, growth and development. Now, we have a lot of different terms for describing countries that are wealthy versus those that aren't. Okay? Now, I talked about this before, but there's a great difference between economic growth and economic development. Okay? Economic development is a multidimensional phenomenon which talks about health and education and other issues that improve individuals' quality of life. Okay? Whereas GDP and per capita income growth is a very narrow thing. Okay? If we were to buy 1,000 airplanes, equip them with missiles, use those missiles to destroy some banana republic, that would be considered a net gain to GDP, and yet aggregate welfare would arguably be lower. So GDP is just the best target we have for wealth, but it's not the most comprehensive. And so what I want you to do is to understand that GDP growth, GDP per capita are simply means to an end to provide all of the things that we want. Okay? Now, we have a lot of different terms for less developing countries. I'm just going to give you some of them here. Now, first we can talk about the rich world, and we can talk about the poor world. We can talk about industrialized countries and industrializing countries. We can talk about emerging states, emerging economies. Talk about advanced industrial states. We can talk about the global north versus the global south. There's the first, second, and third world, a construct from the Cold War. All of these things describe the notion that rich countries are ontologically separate from poor countries, and in turn must be dealt with separately. Okay? Now, it's very difficult for us to project a certain path to economic growth, because we just don't know one right off the top of our head. Yet there are generally two broad concepts associated with economic growth. Two metrics of them that we generally see. These are significant shifts in the structure of developing countries as they develop economically. First is urbanization. Economic growth is usually accompanied with a decreasing proportion of society living in rural areas and a greater, ever-increasing proportion of society living in urban areas. This is empirically proven true time and time again. And so now we must ask ourselves, why is this the case? Why is it that urbanization tends to go hand in hand with economic growth? That's not rhetorical. Any opinions? Yeah, please.
Fewer people needed in agriculture,
Mm-hmm.
and gravitate to the cities because of jobs and other
Jobs.
opportunities.
Very good. So we could argue that if countries develop along a certain value chain, okay, the idea that first they start developing agricultural products, then they develop manufacturing products, and later into higher value-added services, right? If we assume that economies tend to mimic that trajectory, which historically they have, it's very easy to harness urbanized workforces when building large factories. Okay? It provides a centralized labor pool that allows countries to take advantage of economies of scale of different manufacturing processes. Okay? Now, related to your answer, in addition to having rising rural to urban migrations, we also tend to see a falling share of agriculture as a percentage of GDP. Economic growth typically takes place with fewer people working on farms and other subsistence activities and partaking in higher end production. Okay? So those are kind of the broad swaths. Now, as you'll see in lectures 3 and 4, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about theories of economic growth. Many of these theories assume these two phenomena. Okay? And that's why it's important to note them now. Now, the best delineation we have for different countries' incomes pertains to the World Bank's 4 categories of countries based on GDP per capita. So I'd like to draw your attention to this document, Development Characteristics of Income Groups and Selected Countries. Everybody have a copy of it? Now typically, the World Bank's classification is as follows. Low-income countries generally have a GDP per capita of less than $765. So GDP per person of less than $765. Now, these typically, these are low-income countries, and most of these overwhelmingly are located in sub-Saharan Africa. Low-income countries according to the World Bank classification. Now, they also have lower middle-income countries with a GDP per capita from $765 to $3,035, excuse me. And most of these countries are either in Latin America or emerging Asia, namely countries in Southeast Asia like Indonesia. Okay. Then we have upper middle income countries with a GDP per head of $3,035 to $9,385. And this includes, rising Asian giants, India and China. And finally, we have high-income countries, which are typically your OECD countries, with GDP per capita greater than $9,385 a head. Now, looking at the first page here, we can see certain averages of different income groups. But notice how, now I'm talking here, okay, in the top portion of this. Notice how we have certain metrics of these different groups. The first is energy use tends to rise and correspond with income. That's the first major insight here. Now, why is that the case? Well, in order to have an industrial economy, it takes a lot of power to do so. Okay, in order to run large urban centers, you need good transportation to get people from the countryside to the urban areas. Okay, energy use tends to increase with income. Now, given the global commodity boom over the past 10 years, this makes sense, given in the context of rising India and rising China. Okay, prices, assuming they move with supply and demand, with a relatively fixed supply of resources and seemingly unlimited demand of newly industrialized countries, it would lead us to believe that we will indeed see higher commodity prices going forward. Now, as discussed earlier, we can see that a rural population percentage of total steadily declines as countries get richer. Low-income countries, in low-income countries, about 71% of their populace live in rural areas, and in high-income countries, that ratio is only 22%. Life expectancy at birth tends to rise as well with income, as does adult literacy. Now, turning the page here, we have some various metrics, and these are taken out of your book and updated, okay, for 2010. Your book's done in 2003. But what I want to point you towards are the charts, figures 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4. Now, this is why we care about GDP. Okay, again, GDP is a means to an end. So, energy consumption per capita tends to increase as income goes up. We know that. That's 1.1. Look at figure 1.2. Income goes up, and rural populations tend to fall with it. Okay? Again, that's epiphenomenal of this process of economic growth. And then in figure 1.3, and this is arguably one of the biggest goals of economic growth, look how well life expectancy tends to track with GDP per capita. Okay? Flat out direct relationship. The wealthier a country is, the higher the living standards tend to be, the greater the quality of medical care tends to be, lower mortality, all of those things lead to a higher average life expectancy. Okay? And female adult literacy is what's graphed in figure 1.4, and we can see that that too trends relatively directly with income per capita. Now, that's why we care about income per capita. Okay? Income per capita is our best metric of wealth that yields all of these other things that allows us to have a more complete economic development trajectory. Okay? Any questions on that particular document? Yes?
Well, I just have an interesting observation about
Please.
India in particular. On the first page, while we know India is the next economic power, an emerging country, it still is in the group of the low income for the per capita. There's a debate going on in the World Bank why India should continue borrowing when it's already become such an economic power, or will be. And the answer is population. It's still home to over 1 billion poor people who live less than $1 a day. So this is actually a very interesting observation. I just wanted to
Sure. Yeah, I think that's something that tends to get ignored when we talk about the rising power of places like China and India. Yes, the size of the pie or a country's total GDP is very important, but yeah, you're absolutely right. The GDP divided by per head, or the average slice of the pie of the average person in that country, is very relevant. Now we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to our population lecture. But population could be a detriment to economic growth as well as an enabler. We're going to talk about conditions under which population helps and hurts. Yeah.
I was just wondering, are you going to maybe mention some of the works of Amartya Sen and his work on comparing the GDP versus the development of an individual and how much they can achieve as a person? And now this goes to what Ivona was saying with also India.
Yeah.
As the GDP grows, of course the country is booming as the country is an economy. But whether the people individually can grow, that's, I think, an interesting aspect of it. And Amartya Sen was defending for years. In the end,
Sure.
he got a
Yeah, that's definitely, Sen's argument's well taken. We'll talk
China
about
as well, in my opinion, China as well.
Sure.
How much people can grow in that country individually while they're producing the income of the country.
Absolutely. That's an excellent point, and that's actually something we're going to talk about, this concept of uneven development, wherein the spoils of economic development tend to accrue first and foremost to those people who are very, very wealthy within these countries already. Okay, those who already own a good deal of capital in whatever scarce amount of capital that China has tends to be the people. Those groups of people tend to be the ones who share in the original spoils of economic development. That's absolutely true, and that's definitely a challenge, I think, going forward. Okay. Any other observations? Nishit, yes, please.
So according to the GDP guys look a little bit off from this, and that you were.
I beg your pardon?
You were talking about the definition of low income is 760. Is that like an older stat? It sounds like it's $2,300.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just, when I look at, for example, the female adult literacy relationship between this and the rising income, this information doesn't really explain the relationship. Is it as income goes up, is it which is the cause and which is the effect of, or is as literacy goes up, that drives the income higher?
That is a great observation, and we're going to talk about that. That concept in particular, it's colloquially the chicken or the egg, or social scientists would say endogeneity. Is it that societies, as they get richer, tend to have literacy tends to rise, or is rising literacy a precondition for rising income? That's a great question, and as we'll see when we talk about in the role of education and primary school enrollment, we don't really know, and there are convincing arguments to be made in either direction. That's a great point. Confusing cause and effect in particular is something we struggle with as social scientists. Good question. Good point. Anything else? No? Well, all good discussions. Now, what I want to do in the final bit of lecture is talk about the Lant Pritchett article, What's the Big Idea? The Third Generation of Policies for Economic Growth. And I'd like to draw your attention to this chart, entitled Table 3, Are There Any Big Ideas Left? Does everybody have one of these? Okay. So, highly recommend you take a look at this article, because they basically distill about 50 years of economic policy making and orthodoxy into this article. And what I mean by that is that economists in policymakers' opinions about certain dimensions of development has been highly variable and fluid over time. So, I want to get a quick definition of terms here. So, I'm talking about the first column right now. We have government, which is, of course, the actual apparatus of the state. What role does the state play in development? We have accumulation. Now, accumulation really is referring to capital accumulation, okay? Plant, property, equipment, investment, that's what they're talking about. Trade and integration, so the degree to which a state has open capital account, open current accounts, whether or not they're integrated in the global economy, there's different views of that over time. The role of foreign capital, namely FDI and portfolio flows. And finally, development assistance in the form of multilaterals, which many of you in the development community know is an important aspect of economic growth. Now, what's interesting about this article is both of these authors talk about how the development consensus over the past 40 years has swung fairly wildly like a pendulum. So thinking back to kind of the post-World War II Keynesian consensus, as it was known, there are certain metrics in 1962 that we tended to adhere to. The first was the idea that the government can play a central role in development, that the state is the solution and not the problem to development. It was largely assumed to be, it was part of the economic orthodoxy in 1962. The second is the notion of accumulation. Accumulation is still central, and yet there's a great role for the government to accumulate capital in order to lead to that accumulation. Okay? That the state can pick different industries, different winners to accumulate capital, which can in turn lead to development. Trade and integration. The first wave of development scholars was rather agnostic about the role of integration, of global integration. Now, why might this be the case? What was true about the global financial system, perhaps, in the 1960s?
Less global.
I'm sorry?
Less global.
Far less global. Very good. Why is that?
Hegemonic.
You had a handful of players.
Sure, so power was held by a much narrower number of people. What about the global monetary system after World War II? Well, we had the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates, okay? And most countries had closed capital accounts, okay? So the notion of an open capital account is a source of foreign financing didn't really exist as it did today. Or it existed, but it was feared, okay? If you have any questions on that, we can talk about the different monetary arrangements since World War II. And finally, development assistance. It was largely viewed to provide project-based lending of investable foreign exchange and resources to government, meaning financing things like power plants, water projects, etc. Now, for a variety of reasons, this orthodoxy that was created in 1962 broke down. Some of those reasons include the stark failure of strong central planning, namely the failure of the USSR and the failure of Maoist China to achieve large-scale economic growth. Secondly, we had the success of Japan and other mini-dragons, such as Hong Kong, who grew because of exports. They were very export-oriented. So that kind of belied the orthodoxy of the 1960s. Furthermore, during the 1970s, we had a series of oil shocks from which many countries could not recover. We also had the overhang of the disappointment of import substitution industrialization in Latin America. Import substitution industrialization, we'll spend more time on this in subsequent lectures, but it's the notion that you can enact large trade barriers, have infant industry production for domestic industries, have them develop internally, which will allow entire economies to compete on a more even playing field. That's import substitution in a nutshell. This failed rather starkly in the 1970s. Places like India tried import substitution, and that begat the concept of the Hindu rate of growth. of 2% a year in line with the population growth rate, despite the fact that they were very poor and should have been growing very quickly. And finally, in the beginning of the 1980s, we had a series of emerging market debt crises, which called into question many of the prominent ideas in the 1960s. Now, in 1982, then, we decided to reformulate the economic orthodoxy according to a new line. And I want you guys to think of this 1982 orthodoxy as really being crystallized in the 1990s, particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union, and what we're enshrined in the idea of the Washington Consensus by John Williamson. Okay, the Washington Consensus. Now, you're going to read some primary source documents about the Washington Consensus later on, but what's important to note is that the Washington Consensus was largely a byproduct of, one, the United States winning the Cold War, and also the failure of Keynesianism, namely brought about by the oil shocks in the 70s. So, what are some of these ideas? The first is that government plays a central role, but it can also be a main obstacle to development. The government, large government bureaucracies might protect entrenched interests, which might not create the conditions for economic growth. That was part of this new wave of theorizing in the 1980s. The second, with regards to accumulation, it's key to development, yet the composition of accumulation should be largely private. Private entities, multinational corporations, who respond to the incentives of the free market, are best at allocating capital to its most productive ends. Vis-a-vis trade and integration, exports can bring about enormous advantages. Import competition is a necessary force in disciplining domestic industries. Right? Large companies responding to the whims of the global marketplace will be more inclined to operate efficiently and in turn lead to income growth for that country itself. In terms of foreign capital, this was largely a repudiation of spendthrift governments, that government borrowing should be avoided, yet private borrowing should be allowed. Companies should be allowed to borrow in global capital markets, FDI should be allowed, etc. And finally, development assistance and the role of multilaterals. Again, this is possible, yet loans shouldn't be unconditional. So that's when you get to IMF and World Bank conditionality for loans. Meeting certain regulatory or economic benchmarks is a condition of receiving the funding in the first place. You could think of the difference between 1962 and 1982 largely is a swing of power from states to markets. States to markets, 60s to 80s. And this really took place as a part of the neoliberal economic paradigm ushered in by Reagan and Thatcher, the notion of free enterprise, deregulation. This is kind of an extension of that, of government being the problem. And that was the economic orthodoxy in 1982. But that too tended, like all economic orthodoxies, tended to be belied by the facts on the ground. Now, in 2002, just as a point of discussion, we had a slowdown in growth throughout the developing world, especially Latin America, brought about by financial crises. Okay? Moreover, the transition from central planning towards private means of production and private ownership was very disastrous in certain parts of the world. Okay, think of the oligarchs in Russia, or the botched privatization of state-run industries in former Soviet states. Moreover, in the 1980s and 1990s, financial crises tended to increase in both their frequency and magnitude. And finally, we had things like we had countries like China and India with very fast growth, and yet they were slow and cautious reformers, favoring pragmatism over ideology. And so, Pritchett and Lindauer end on a note that perhaps in 2002 we've achieved an age of the end of big ideas in development. The whole notion of a one-size-fits-all economic orthodoxy might not be the case anymore. So I urge you to read this article because it gives you a lot of historical grounding in the current ideas in development that take place today. Okay? Are there any questions on this particular piece? Yep, you look like you have a comment.
Yeah, I mean, this is, glad I'm taking this class after like many and some of the financial market regulation classes I've already taken, but curious whether you're gonna, at the end of the course, talk about maybe the pendulum swinging in this country. I mean, in many ways, we're now seeming to be less developed and maybe, not that we're less developed, but the advice we've given others sort of hypocritically, we're now saying, wait a second, maybe we gotta listen to it.
Definitely.
Current events at the very end of this? Or?
Yeah, no, for sure. And also the policy brief will be heavily oriented towards this notion of, is there an emerging Beijing consensus, and is that the direction? Is state-led authoritarian capitalism kind of the next wave? So yeah, no, stay tuned. Right? Yes?
In the comments to it, it was Broderick, talked about his main question was why the economics taught in classrooms become so divergent from economics as practiced by institutions. And that was, I'm not an economist, so I don't understand that. And
Yeah.
some more insight on that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So the pedagogical approach of economics, if you were to be an undergrad, if you were to get an undergraduate degree in economics at a place like Harvard or something, macroeconomics in particular, development economics, it's formulated deductively, and it assumes that it's taught basically with certain assumptions like financial services industry, the financial sector of economies is relatively contained and always working, that the pipes and machinery of economies tends to work over time. So you have, when economics is taught in the classroom, there are many assumptions that undergird everything. So when we discuss the theories of economic growth in lectures 3 and 4, you're going to see me say, we're going to assume constant returns to scale. We're going to assume a homogeneous good. We're going to assume, a uniform savings rate across the economy. The problem with economics in practice is that all these assumptions are relaxed. And so I think his contention is economics in practice tends not to resemble any form of the highly stylized classroom economics that are taught to students today. In Skidelsky, in his new book about Keynes in 2009, spends a lot of time talking about that as well. Return of the Master is the name of the book, and that might shed some more light onto that. Okay? Good question. I saw another hand, maybe? Yeah?
Could we go back briefly to growth and development? I lost track of writing my notes. You said there were two concepts, shifts in structure. You talked about urbanization. What were the two concepts?
Sure, it's urbanization,
Right.
and a falling share of agriculture as a percentage of GDP.
Okay.
Good question. Cool. Anything else? No? All right. Well, definitely take a look at this piece because it'll be a great resource for you over the course of the semester. Finally, we have to end with Easterly. So I passed out an article by Easterly in which he is, and a response, by the way. This appeared in the Financial Times in May of 2008, so after Bear Stearns but before Lehman. And this is about as clear a repudiation of development as an industry as you're going to get from an economist. Okay, on the other side.
Yeah, I know, but there is something that's
Yeah, that's a response. That's a letter to the editor in response to it. So we're fair and balanced here in this class. So this particular piece is excellent. And what's Easterly's complaint? Well, if you read the first 5 pages of Easterly, he basically comes out and says that economists have taken wrong turns in their ideology many times over the past 50 years. And that they're constantly looking for some type of panacea to economic growth. These development experts. So what do they look at? Well, they look at things like capital accumulation. You must accumulate capital at all costs. Or you must have a liberalized capital accounting. That's the guarantor of economic development. Easterly tends to criticize the economics establishment as such. And he basically says that, look, we just have no idea where economic growth comes from. And that all these technocrats running around trying to solve poor countries' problems, that they themselves, these technocrats, are actually part of the problem. What do you guys think about that?
Well,
Please.
I'm not an economist, but I have to say now what my macroeconomics professor said at Carey School now makes sense. and he is a professor, he's been professor now for many years. And then he made a point that there is only two tools or instruments that the economists like to use. It's fiscal policy or monetary policy. And he says, apart from that, we don't like the novelty. We like to rely on what we know, not to experiment. And this is kind of, in a way, that you're talking about. And that's why there's all these technocrats running around with same offers for different problems, because
Sure.
maybe partly that's the reason.
I think that's
They
a
only
fair
have
point.
so many instruments that they can rely on, or they think they can rely on.
That's a good observation. Win?
I mean, I think for the most part, it's a fair criticism if kind of taken broadly that, you know, any kind of attempt to look at, you know, one panacea for, you know, all poor countries is not going to work, and that seems fair. But it almost seems like kind of like trivially true. Like I don't think most like sophisticated economists or, you know, researchers at the World Bank really have a kind of like monocausal view of development. I think lots of people, like Amartya Sen, for example, really, you know, try to emphasize the breadth of issues that are kind of that matter.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people like that would say that we can very much talk about development, and we can just do so by talking about many different elements at once instead of just focusing on one thing.
Sure. Yes, you're basically saying that it's a bit of a straw man to claim that, you know, economists think inside the box and believe in these monocausal explanations. That really, the practitioners are a bit more diverse than that. I think that's a fair criticism. What else, guys? What do you think about the easterly point? Well, you'll have to. Oh, do you have? Yeah.
I was going to say,
Please.
I read his book, The White Man's Burden.
Yeah.
I remember reading, I just coincidentally, I mean, I've never done any development, but I picked up Jeffrey Sachs's book, The End of Poverty.
Yeah.
And then the next book I read was The White Man's Burden. I was
Yeah.
just blown away by these two
Divergence.
very different viewpoints.
Sure.
But easterly, it seemed to me to have a very convincing argument in you know, the development experts. If you just look at history in the last 50 years and the tens of billions of dollars that have been spent on development, it hasn't been real successful. And if you look at areas of the world historically where there's been tremendous gains in, I guess in China and India, where hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of, you know, real extreme poverty, and it's happened, you know, certainly in the absence of any, you know, big ideas and development. So, you know, I think Easterly's onto something.
That's fair. I mean, I think what you know, somebody like Sachs would say in his own defense is that we just don't know the counterfactual, how bad it could have been in some of these developing countries without without the aid and help and support of the global financial development technocrats writ large. That's a fair response to that. Yeah.
I don't know the word reading, but does he propose an alternative to development experts?
He's a bit glib about that. I mean, he says in one hand, he says, my students at New York University would have been happy to supply statements like the ones above, which were very dismissive of the ability to actually know how economic growth happens, to these to the World Bank for a lot less than $4 million. I think that's emblematic.
So guesswork essentially is just as good.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big school. It's almost anti-positivist insofar as that a lot of economists today, I like to think of William Easterly kind of in the same bucket as Nassim Taleb. Have you heard of this guy? He wrote the book A Fool by Randomness and later The Black Swan. And his whole point is that there's a lot of epistemic hubris that exists in the world today. And that we have to be able to say we don't know, and that's okay. Without coming up with some monolithic counter school. I think that's where Easterly sees himself. Now you might say, look, okay, it's really easy to be just critical all the time without coming up with something else. And I think that's a fair criticism of Easterly. But I think there's room also for just the critical eye without putting forth. And I think that this is your own opinion here. Where you kind of fall on the spectrum. I don't want to influence you any more than that. Yeah, Wynn?
I was just curious. This book was written in like 2003 or so, right?
Yeah.
And since then, there have been some kind of big developments in development policy and stuff. For example, conditional cash transfers that have been shown to be pretty successful in a lot of places. And you have new development initiatives in the U.S. like the Millennium Challenge account that address a lot of the criticisms that people like Easterly leveled at them. I guess I was curious. Do you know? Is he equally as critical of these things, or how are these viewed in the development community in general?
Sure. Oh well, how they're viewed in the developing community, I think certainly in my conversations with people who work at places like the World Bank and IMF, I think anything that works is generally prided. That said, there's a very strong neoliberal bent to almost everything they do. So when we went to China and David Dollar talked about the need for China to reform and liberalize domestic institutions, there's still very much that bent, that almost ideological persuasion to it. So, certainly, I think there's been some retrenchment, some more humility, but they're still not without their ideological biases. As are we too. I think that's an important point. It's easy to claim everybody thinks they're a pragmatist, and everybody thinks everybody else is ideological. So, that's definitely part of it. But that's a great point. The key takeaway from Easterly is just there is no panacea, and economic growth matters for everything. I think that's his first chapter, which it is assigned for today. So definitely take a look at it. That economic growth is the currency by which everything is accomplished. Infant mortality is reduced, quality of life improves, arguably peace and prosperity in the international system is dependent on economic growth. That's why he dubs it this elusive quest, and that even though it's thus far eluded the economic community, it doesn't mean that rising income isn't something worth fighting for. And I think that's if there's one thing that I want you to take away from the class, it's that. Okay, I'm with Easterly on that one. That we're going to have to end class a little bit early because I want to leave time for you to complete a survey. So before we get to the survey, any final questions? No? Great. All right, I'm going to pass out the survey. Just try to complete it, and then you're free after that, and we'll have class on Thursday. And there's two sides to it, front and back. So just scribble down answers and bounce in a minute. Okay. Here you go. Thank you. Yep.
Today, for this class?
Thank you for reminding me. No. Those okay. So periodically, I was gonna pass those out while you guys were writing it. But periodically, I will just grab various articles from places like The Economist, Financial Times, etc., and post them onto Blackboard. I printed them out today. I will usually do this, but also post them there. These articles I give you are not in any particular order. They are just ways for you to kind of engage the subject matter holistically, okay? Out of order, just kind of applying it. So I picked one article on the notion of can poor countries leapfrog manufacturing and grow rich on services? And then another one about the Beijing consensus as an alternative to the Washington consensus. So I'll pass these out. Right now.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Can you, in regard to the mathematical portion of the course,
yeah.
Can you maybe tell us right now what readings address that subject matter specifically?
Yeah, sure. You mean within the Math Companion, or?
No, ignore the Math Companion.
Yeah.
What readings can we look at to see the mathematics related subject matter?
Yeah, fair enough. Check out chapter 3, 4. Yeah, chapters 3 and 4 in your textbook.
All right.
Are pretty. That'll be a good.
That's the essence of the math.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Professor,
And when you get to your problem set too, you'll see. Yeah. Question.
could you continue on with the Math Companion? You're going to.
No, I was going to say the whole thing's important.
Oh.
Yeah.
I was hoping there was going to be some specific. Yeah.
I mean, you'll see. Have you taken a look at it? I mean,
No, not
there's
yet.
a lot that's just like this is what an integer is. This is how fractions are like division. I mean, there's a lot of basics in it. So just skim that, the hard parts, and concentrate on chapters 4 and 5. Yeah. I'll pass out the articles now.
So we typically print this, and we don't need to print them then?
You don't need to print them. They're for your own edification. They're not considered required reading, but it's just another way for you to kind of see where the. Normally there won't be as many handouts, but you know, first day is how it goes. Just take one at a time. Yeah. Give me a good fodder for my dissertation, that's about it. Pretty good?
I can get that in order.
Yeah, yeah, you can also, just, you can grab this one too. So, if you have any trouble with this one. Alright. Thank you. Oh, and so I did that. Yes, definitely, we'll have lots of sessions, so don't worry.
Yeah.
We're close to 60. Yeah, the right orders. If you have the right orders of magnitude, I think that's the key. Alright, oh, thank you for recording.
Gotcha.
Yeah, of course.
New York, Washington.
What other classes do you
I'll just give this, but I'm also.
You know, if you did a non-econ course, I think that'd be if you were to take theories of IR, I think you theories of natural relations or something. Oh, that's actually, okay, great. I think that'd be fine. A lot of people take two. Oh yeah. The issue is if you take two econ courses, you're gonna have problems. So see, this is math. Working as a degree like macro and micro, that's tough. Because that's every night, 6 to 8:30, and then 5:45 to 8:30, and then the problem sets and TA sessions. It gets a little overbearing.
How many hours would you be coming out of?
Thank you.
Questions?
No, no, please.
How would classroom,
Probably about 2.5 to 3 hours of reading per class session. That's probably close. I mean, depending on you can skim a lot of stuff too. But definitely you want to read the textbook and read the history book and the assigned articles pretty closely. And then it depends on what you are with the problem set and the policy brief and the work you put into it.
Right.
So
Policy briefs after the midterm.
yeah.
Midterm again?
It's like the 17th, I think. Wait, it's on the syllabus. But yeah.
Okay, I still want to get it over my head because I'm coming up to one thing. I'm pretty confident that kind of background, so this is very different, but I'm watching the question.
Yeah. I mean, if you're used to an academic environment, though, I think it's 21st. Yeah. If you're used to an academic environment, though, I mean, that's half the battle.
Yeah, and the classes, they're geared towards people who are working full time, so there's an understanding that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and you have weekends.
Right, that's what they're for. Okay, all right, I'll
cool.
think about it.
All right, cool. Yeah, cool. But take this one. Don't take something else in its place.
Okay.
What's for GDP?
What's that? Close to 60. 2009.
How close?
I think it was like 59. What'd you put? Hey, thank you. Did you? Oh, that's pretty good. Yeah. Thanks, man.
Am I close?
Wait, what'd you read?
I was 6% of what?
40 trillion? A lot, I like that. It's closer to 60. Yeah, I don't know, I just put that on there for kicks. See if people know. Sam, are you filling out that form or?
No, I'm just reading the Economist article that you
Oh, word.
So the best thing is to get the 2 books, and the rest I'll get basically online on the back.
Exactly, yeah. And you can just print them out or just read them on the computer, whatever's easier for you. But,
I'm also taking practical research methods. And, does that sort of tie into each other a little bit, or is that completely different?
a little bit.
I guess it would tie into each other.
Yeah. I think
One is more like numerical, I guess, and this is more explanation-wise, or how?
I would say, well, this has some some mathematics associated with it, but yeah, by and large, it's pretty. You should. I mean, I don't know. I guess this class is probably a little less quantitative.
And the other one is more quantitative.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
But cool.
Thanks,
All right. See ya. Thank you. Got a good crew here.
Oh yes, I missed the intros.
Yeah, kinda nice.
Where's everybody coming from?
Not a lot of Sci students actually.
Oh, I mean, I could tell just by looking around, huh? More what? Working professionals?
Yeah.
Where are people coming from?
A lot of bank.
World
Some guy works like the U.S. Coast Guard.
Oh, wow.
Kind of random, but good mix.
I was just, I was meeting earlier with, Kalari, who's over at the Wolf, he used to be at the IFC.
Ah, okay.